I rise today to support this bill and to outline the rationale for some amendments I seek to move to strengthen the bill, and particularly in its commitment to inclusive education, transparency and accountability. This bill, of course, presents an important opportunity to give genuine effect to South Australia's stated vision of inclusive education, a vision where every child, regardless of disability or learning profile, is given the opportunity to belong, to participate and to thrive in their local school. Yet, as it currently stands, there remains areas within this bill that fall short of that ambition. The amendments I will be moving have been developed following direct consultation with Dr Peter Spiro, whose expertise in disability discrimination and inclusive education has been quite invaluable to my office, and I thank her for that. Dr Spiro's PhD research and her evidence before the Social Development Committee's Human Rights Inquiry in 2024 have shed light on the lived experience of families who have fought for their children who have complex learning profiles to access inclusive education in our state of South Australia. Her work, alongside her review of public submissions to the draft exposure bill, including the submission from the Centre for Inclusive Education at QUT, identifies some of the structural and cultural barriers that continue to limit genuine inclusion in our state of South Australia. The QUT Centre for Inclusive Education is one of Australia's leading research institutes in this field. Its researchers are internationally recognised for their work on evidence-based inclusion, school reform and system-led accountability. The Centre played a key role, of course, in developing national frameworks for inclusive education and conducted the 2020 Graham et al. Review into suspension, exclusion and expulsion processes in South Australian state schools, which is a comprehensive Government Commission review led by Professor Linda Graham. And that review, of course, exposed systemic overuse of disciplinary exclusions and the disproportionate impact of those practices on students with disability, on ATSE students and students in care. It also demonstrated the importance of transparent data, of early intervention and professional support to keep students engaged in schooling. These insights, of course, are directly relevant to the South Australian context and have informed the amendments I propose today. And I do note back then that review by the QUT Centre was actually secured in an agreement between myself and in collaboration with the former Shadow Minister and the former Minister. So both former Minister Susan Close and the former Minister and then later Minister John Gardner were involved in that particular discussion. And we actually produced a report that should be now being incorporated into what we do as we go forward. First, I turn to Section 62 of the Education and Children's Services Act 2019. The provision there empowers the Chief Executive to direct a student's enrolment in certain circumstances. While originally intended to support appropriate placement decisions, it raises concerns about compatibility with inclusive education principles and lacks procedural safeguards. I support the government's proposal to repeal Section 62(1)(a), which currently allows the Chief Executive to direct a child with disability to a particular school, including a special school, if deemed necessary or appropriate. That repeal is a step in the right direction. However, Dr Spiro's expert opinion demonstrates that the remaining subsections, namely 62(1)(b) and (c), may still enable gatekeeping practices that will limit access to mainstream education for children with disabilities. These practices occur when families are advised or pressured or informally directed away from their local schools on the basis that inclusion is, quote, not practical, or that the child's needs would somehow be better met elsewhere. Sometimes these decisions are framed as being in the interests of safety or welfare of others, yet far too often they actually reflect a lack of will to provide reasonable adjustments. Dr Spiro's research, including interviews with conciliators from 3 equality agencies, has documented how hypothetical or extreme scenarios are somehow invoked to justify exclusion rather than to explore how inclusion might be achieved. Such practices, of course, undermine the right to inclusive education under Article 24 on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and are inconsistent with the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992 at the Commonwealth level and the Disability Standards for Education 2005. The amendments that I have filed would address this by ensuring that before the Chief Executive directs a child's placement, the child must have been given a genuine opportunity to be enrolled in their local school with the provision of reasonable adjustments and supports based on the best available research and evidence. This amendment will give legislative force to what inclusion should already mean in practice. That is, exclusion is the last result, not the first response. Secondly, I draw this Council's attention to another area of concern raised by Dr Spiro after reviewing the submission made by the Centre for Inclusive Education and the findings of the Graham Review. The Bill's proposal to exempt certain new provisions, including what would be sections 63B, 80A6 and 81B6 from the operation of the Freedom of Information Act 1991. These exemptions would prevent public access to important information about enrolment, disciplinary and behavioural practices in our new schools. If enacted, they will conceal data that is actually essential for understanding how inclusion, exclusion and discipline operate in principle across our state education system. Transparency is fundamental to public trust, and Dr Spiro's review of the submissions to the draft exposure bill emphasised that without access to such data, it is impossible to know whether inclusive education is being delivered equitably or whether particular groups of students, especially those with disability, are being disproportionately excluded. Therefore, all provisions, including the FOI Act's application, I will contend should be removed, and removing these exemptions will promote transparency and accountability and support public oversight of exclusionary practices, as well as enhancing confidence in South Australia's commitment to inclusive education. An inclusive education system cannot be built behind closed doors. It requires openness, collaboration and evidence. By embedding transparency and genuine inclusion in our legislation, we take a necessary step towards ensuring that every child in South Australia can access the education that they not only deserve in their local school, but they should be able to expect in their local school, with the supports they need and within a system that welcomes them rather than shuts them out. I acknowledge the government's positive work in bringing this bill forward and its commitment in advancing inclusive education across our state. The amendments I propose will build on that foundation. They do not seek to oppose it, rather they aim to ensure that the legislation delivers on its promise and that inclusion is not just an aspiration, but a lived reality for every South Australian child. And I invite members of this council to consider these constructive amendments. And I note that while the government so far has not been terribly receptive in our conversations and has raised concerns such as a lack of definition currently in the Act for a local school as one of those barriers, I flag also that I will soon file a definition of local school for the government to further consider, so that we may perhaps have an education that is truly inclusive, does afford students in the state system to be able to be enrolled in their local school where they have that entitlement and should have that expectation, not only under our various human rights mechanisms, but in what most South Australians would assume would be the standard practice in 2025. And with that, I do commend the bill and look forward to the committee debate.